Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to the Grand Finals of Malaysia World 2015. Teams participating in the Grand Finals are, in opening government, the University of Oxford Union A. We have the University of Sydney Union A. And we have Harvard University A. Before we begin, I would like to introduce the panel of judges judging this evening. We have Mr. Dominic from Monash University of Australia. Amelia from the University of Canada. From Utrecht University of the Netherlands. Merckens from Leiden University of the Netherlands. Mr. Frazer, formerly from the University of Alaska of the United States of America, and Mr. Tunnicliffe from the University of Durham of the United States. We have Mr. Andrew from Asia Pacific University of Malaysia. I now call this House to order. The motion before the House is that this House believes that humanitarian organizations should be allowed to give funding, resources, or services to illegal armed groups when this is made a condition for access to vulnerable civilians. To begin this debate, I would like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is a great privilege to open the Grand Final in this wonderful venue, but we are conscious of the fact that right now, hundreds of thousands of people remain trapped in the region of Donetsk because humanitarian groups are too intransigent, too unwilling to recognize the strategic factors they have made the wrong one, and are unwilling to work with pro-Russian militias in ensuring the humanitarian corridor is open and those people get the relief that they need and don't risk their lives being lost in that. We are proud to stand for a mechanism that says this should be a tool in the toolbox of humanitarian groups that allows them to make a decision that says it is important in some cases to ensure that we will work with these groups in order to ensure that relief gets to those who are most vulnerable. That means that we are not going to stand up here today and defend our group working with genocidal groups like Hutu militias. What we do stand for is making a reasonable calculation, working with groups like the Mora Islamic Liberation, or like the Tamil Tigers, or like the Wiggins, or like the Indian militias, who have made an important condition that in order for humanitarian groups like Medicine Sans Frontières to access civilians, they also have to recognise and provide support to those groups on the ground. We think that is an important thing that they do. So, why do we think that's important? It does mean you can possibly get the creation of a humanitarian corridor in which you literally evacuate large numbers of civilians from war-torn areas, from dangerous areas where people are being bombed, are at risk of death. We think that is in and of itself an incredibly valuable thing. Secondly, it means, as we've seen with the Kachin group in Myanmar, that if you can actually work with those armed groups that are defined as illegal by the state. You can then provide clean water, you can provide education, you can provide very basic healthcare. You can ensure that people that have been injured are actually treated, because very often these groups simply don't have the resources to provide that. These are the kind of valuable things that we're talking about. So, the first thing that I'm going to bring to my speech today is to talk about why these groups are presently cutting off access to civilians. We think that it's very important to recognise here the kind of incentive structures these groups face. Fundamentally, people like the pro-Russian militias in Donetsk, people like the Tamil Tigers, are deeply suspicious of humanitarian groups like Christian Aid, like the Red Cross, like MSF. They are suspicious of them because they have been used in the past and could be used in the future to smuggle government propaganda and government support into those regions. They have a very real and legitimate suspicion about these groups. What's more, they have been identified in the past with the very state that they are often opposing, and that remains a very real barrier. And thirdly, they also just believe that they are protecting those civilians by their very existence, by the war that they are fighting. And so it is quite natural for them to make a condition that they get recognition and support to their group if humanitarian relief is going to go to those civilians. For these groups, they identify the two things as being perfectly compatible. Give us resources, give us funding, we're protecting civilians, we're actually ultimately fighting for their long-term interests, and on the other side of the coin, actually providing humanitarian relief to those people. So that is the overriding rationale for these groups, for these militias, for people like the Tamil Tigers. Now, even if you don't buy that, even if you take the most mercenary, unkind, ungenerous interpretation of their logic, we think that fundamentally they need civilian support in order to survive. They need civilians on the side. They're constantly fighting a propaganda war in their country, which they have to be shown to be the ones that are ultimately interested in the long-term welfare of the people of that state too.
Okay, if this is such a good idea and the principle is so important, why exclude genocide of groups?
We think come on, you cannot push us into defending the idea of actively supporting a genocide. We think that ultimately, in the case of genocide, there is no possibility for a humanitarian corridor or for providing relief to people because those people are going to be murdered, right? We think that often that genocide is an internal genocide, where it is an external one. We think it is quite reasonable for humanitarian groups to make a calculus in which they determine where more lives will be lost, where they can make the biggest long-term impact. And the problem with what these guys have to argue for is that they want to deny the very existence of that pool. They want to have to deny whether or not humanitarian groups should be allowed to make that calculation, even where ultimately you can get much greater long-term gains. We think that's a big problem. So, why does our model change that? It breaks that suspicion. Even if there is still a risk that Medicine Sans Frontières can smuggle in government propaganda and government arms. Ultimately, it doesn't change the relative equilibrium of power, right? Because even if you get more smuggling in, you've also got more funding and support flowing to the militia group. So the asymmetry doesn't change. That for them is incredibly important. Secondly, it creates a certain level of trust between the two groups, between the aid group and the militia. We think that is valid. And also it just meets their ideological agenda, right? It's part of recognition, it's part of earning their place in that region, and that is important. What follows from that? It means that you do have an increased capacity to have a humanitarian corridor, to save hundreds of thousands of lives, and also to deliver material benefits to people on the ground. We think that if groups turn their back on that option, if groups like Medicine Sans Frontières turn their back on that option, they are fundamentally violating their primary duty, which is to protect the most vulnerable on the ground. Not to get themselves involved in domestic squabbling between state and illegal armed group about what is defined as illegality, about sovereignty, about where territorial lines should lie, but to be protecting women and children and elderly on the ground, those people that are most at risk of losing their lives in any conflict. That is their fundamental duty, and it's the right of those people on the ground to get that aid in the first place. No, thank you. We think this also prolongs the conflict, right? So even if you take the view, this is ultimately a long-term game, and this is not about the primary duty of humanitarian groups, the primary rights of civilians. We think this ultimately extends the conflict. It extends the conflict because it means these groups are more likely to have to turn to alternative sources of funding and support. That includes things like gaining control of diamond mines, as in the case of the west coast of Africa. We think that ultimately that extends the conflict into new areas. It risks even more people's lives. It also means that as with certain groups in the Middle East, they have to ultimately turn to more and more radical networks of financing to get the support that they need. Why do they have to do all of that? Because the analysis I gave you that they need civilian support, they need to be able to provide basic services. And if humanitarian groups won't do it, they will turn somewhere else. And ultimately that ends up with a much more radical militia. It ultimately ends up with the conflict going further and further out of the existing zone of conflict. For all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we argue that this is ultimately consistent with the duty of humanitarian groups. It is the only model that is consistent with the rights of those people that are currently not being protected. And this is something that will ultimately increase the chances of the conflict ending earlier. We are very proud of this place.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for their speech. Now I'd like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to open the Opposition speech. Mr. Speaker, of course we accept that these are issues and situations which are of utmost urgency and which require action, which do very often require intervention. What we say to you, however, on opposition today is firstly that the actor which does this must be legitimate, must have a modicum of information, and must be able to do so, must be able to intervene in a way which is effective and consistent with what is the best policy overall. And we say furthermore that we must never undertake an action which increases the number of vulnerable people who are put at risk by these organisations. So I will integrate rebuttal throughout my speech. The first thing that I want to talk to you about is the morality of these actions and allowing individual organisations to take these actions, to make these decisions on their own. We say that when you give this funding, when you give these resources, things like weaponry, things like arms, communication systems, and transport systems, very important things which terrorist organisations need in order to function. When you give those things to those organisations, you become a part and complicit in the actions in which they partake. You become a direct part of the link in the causal chain and the chain of causation which they use to oppress individuals. We say that is funding that they would not otherwise have without you consenting to giving them things. We say that furthermore, without that funding, without those resources, they simply will be less able to commit the types of atrocities that we all in this debate stand against and abhor. We think that furthermore, it was very interesting that the Prime Minister in this debate said, well, we're not talking about situations of genocide. But we think that's really interesting. It's a huge concession of the principle in this debate, because we say that just because they're not directly killing people doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you shouldn't also, it doesn't mean that they're allowed on opposition or shouldn't opposition be okay with allowing themselves to become a part of the chain of causation in other lesser crimes. It's like saying genocide is a really bad crime and we should therefore treat it differently. We don't see how morally it should be treated differently. We say that all types of oppression should be treated in a way that suggests that they are wrong and should not be continued to proliferate violence. We then tell you why it's different because you simply can't have a humanitarian corridor ever, but you can't have any type of intervention that will be effective. Well, in that case, the distinction that they should have made was one of efficacy, that you should only do it when it's effective, but that's not the distinction made. We're going to read that one too, though, in a few minutes. Now I want to talk to you about why this reduces the access that you have to individuals and why it reduces and disimproves your bargaining position. Okay. So firstly, terrorists very often need this intervention. They very often need this aid to arrive to the people. So what we say is that in the status quo, very often they will be just willing to accept it without conditions in many situations. What you do, so why would that be? Firstly, because they rely on support for the communities who desperately need this aid, right? Organizations like Hamas, like THBT in Pakistan, rely on the communities in which they operate to be able to live their day-to-day lives with some modicum of dignity, with some ability to actually actualize in some sort of way. We think that it's really important that those groups, therefore, have buy-in within those communities for three primary reasons. Firstly, because if they're ones which are militant, which like to fight, we think it's important that they're able to recruit people. They will only be able to recruit people if they can be shown to be doing good for the communities which they claim to represent. Secondly, we think they claim a level of legitimacy. In order to have that legitimacy, by sort of airing the grievance of that group, they need to have that group's support. If they're not able to provide them things, they actually lose that support and they're undermined. Therefore, it's in their interest very often to accept this without condition. No, thank you. Finally, they need private funding. In order to get that private funding, very often what you need is to be able to show that you have support of people on the ground at all. So, for example, if we look at Syria, the groups which have proliferated the most have been the ones which have been able to get private funding from countries such as Qatar in order to make themselves sufficiently powerful in the first place to get the rest of that funding. Therefore, they will accept this funding very often without us needing to make such big concessions, right? However, without this buy-in, they can't do all of that, right?
So it's in their interest to accept that. No, thank you. The proposition never let us play that game, because it's always now the incentive of the terrorist group to issue conditions and to make these offers and to force these offers to be conditional, let us say. That means that very often, in many cases, what we're going to have is a situation where we have to where we basically have to make concessions where we otherwise wouldn't if this wasn't the policy. It means that we cause harm and give weapons to groups which would otherwise never have asked for them because they really need that support anyway. Now they have nothing to lose.
Given that the West supported the Khmer Rouge legitimate government of Cambodia for years, why do you think that legality is a good metric for deciding who should get aid and who shouldn't?
Like, we think that it's just not for individual organizations to decide. I'm going to talk about that in just a few moments. But before that, we think that it's also important to note when he talks about suspicion among the terrorist groups, that he ignores suspicion among the communities to whom this aid goes. If these groups are already unpopular, and you're giving funding to the terrorist group, whose popularity is wavering there, what do? You increase the idea that this is Western stooges giving these guys money, and you increase the idea that the West is a bad guy who's interfering in your business in a way which you don't want, which fundamentally undermines the overall effort there. Let's talk now about why humanitarian organisations are the wrong organisations to be allowed to make these individual decisions. Firstly, they don't have that much information in states, they don't have access to the types of intelligence and to the types of military information that states have. Because a lot of this information is secret, such as what terrorist plans we know about, what operations we might be willing to launch against them, where the LTTE are hiding their weapons and stuff in Sri Lanka, right? We think that secondly, it requires experts to have that information and to weigh it up properly in a way that NGOs simply very often don't have that ability. Recognize that they're okay with letting all of these NGOs do that type of activity. Why is the state better at doing this? Firstly, because it is detached and better and has more information, but secondly, also because it has legitimacy. It takes into account more interests than just those of an NGO, which very often wants to be seen to be doing the most that it can be in order to compete with other NGOs for private funding, which is particularly important because it disaligns their incentives with what we would want them to do. But furthermore, we think that it's especially likely to cause problems because very often, these types of actions, these types of hostage taking or any other situation which is relevant to this debate occurs in a situation where it is convenient for that group to do so in order to get funding. So your group is nearing the end of its resources. The NGO isn't necessarily aware of this. The group then takes hostages and is able to demand some sort of effectively a ransom from NGOs, where it might be better to wait out that situation for a short period of time because we knew that the LTTE were running out of resources. We knew that the LTTE in Sri Lanka were not going to be able to continue their oppression of people because they simply hadn't the funding to do so. We think that had you implemented this policy, you would have given them a further lease of life with a certain loss of further life, civilian life, as a result. For those reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for their speech, and I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
not do this. Secondly, we say that often these are not hostage situations. The point is that they are, for example, things like launching control and drone. Although we recognise the hostage situation might be plausible on some circumstances, what we suggest is that at that point we can also say, no, we will not collaborate with this specific group or employ this specific tactic, right? We do not have to look military groups operating in every single situation. There may be others in the program I'm going to outline now, in which these public access is forming wider trouble. Moreover, we're willing to fight that bullet of them taking civilian hostage if it means on a grander scale we get more access to all civilians globally. And we're willing to say we get to save more lives. Fine, temporarily, we get less access to civilians. In the long term, however, all lives are saved, and we're willing, therefore, to make that thing. Secondly, we're told to consolidate charities unpopular with civilian groups. We will do it secretly. I think that charities should cut the old revenue all the time do it secretly. In addition, even if we can't do it secretly, we think the extensive promotion of services to these groups will probably help us really counter the narrative. Or we could be like, hey guys, you noticed that you were cut off all over time. I'm sorry, this is the only way we could get access. Civilians who have a complex of ability to understand the trade-offs may have to be made sometimes. Sorry. Thirdly, we told that NGOs abandon their students and take the better route. Number one, states often have additional reasons which mean that they do not care about civilian victims. They care about things like oil contracts or wider geopolitical ramifications. We think that in the case of this NGO, their primary concern should be civilian casualties. Secondly, we told that NGOs don't have any information. This is clearly factually untrue. A lot of NGOs have their own think tanks. Moreover, they operate in conjunction with the FCR or other state and public groups whose information they can take into account. They often have people on the ground, right? That's the information that way. You take the time on sorry that the towns like to were incredibly weak and then we could have empowered them. Everyone knew that, right? It is very obvious that the government is about to collapse. They retreated enormously to a global limited amount of ground. It is not like they need to find some concrete examples of where it would be incredibly unobvious that something really dramatic game-changing would happen if we gave them a large amount of weapons, right? It's unclear what this special information is. Okay, so let's look at what this conflict is like and the conflict that we envisage. We think that often civilians are trapped effectively, particularly by accident. As Pat outlined in those early days, often civilians are trapped because rebel groups do not want to allow NGOs to in, but it's currently their consideration is that the relative balance of correlation of forces between the rebel group and an alternative militia or state that they may be opposed to would be altered, potentially, if weapons or propaganda is smuggled in. At the point at which you alter that, or concern about the changing relative correlation of forces, because you get more weapons, so even if some weapons go in, at least you're still balanced. They have an incentive to accept this, let NGOs in, because they also want to get civilians on side, because during asymmetric warfare, what is crucial is having to retreat back to hide and blend in. Because that is why, at the point at which we do this, they have an incentive to allow us to see civilians. In particular, though, let's know what happens specifically, what kind of things happen to these conflicts, right? Number one, they're trapped accidentally in war zones like the look at because things like, cities are bombed down. We think that people die, not because rebel groups kill them, because that would be counterproductive to being able to blend in. But because, for example, they cannot leave a war zone, or because of the associated problems, and therefore they get caught in crossfire, or because of associated problems of war, such as malnutrition, waterborne disease, essential from infrastructure damage, not because of bullets through the head. The weapons that we give militias are going to go against other aggressive actors who are also fighting and fighting militias. Let's not forget, right, the Sri Lankan government was not a nice group, right? They fought for our region. And we are okay. We allow it sometimes. We're able to have that government reform. What we're not okay with is saying we're not going to give you weapons because someone will die, and then thousands of civilians die and innocent people trapped in crossfire rather than continuing the conflict. So even if this conflict is prolonged, even if we take it to that highest point, that these rebels will be suddenly strengthened and have a new gush and win, the point is fewer civilians die because they can exit these areas when their lives are positively improved in this situation. Therefore, fine, the conflict goes on, although we know the conflict's not going on for very different reasons. But the associated harms are comparatively much more limited and therefore more into fight this war. That is why it's, for example, different from genocide, right? Because that's directly against civilians, not against government or alternative rebel forces.
disasters. Given the relative potential impact from a diamond mine in a couple of hostage situations, why would they start here in the first place?
Okay, so this is literally the material I'm just about to get on. Because often doing things like controlling other roads, plantations, agriculture, or mining is time consuming. It's practically why there's really struggle to control territory. You have a limited number of people and a limited number of resources. At that point, you need to make trade-offs and decisions. When you need to get that sort of funding, you have to take a trade-off, for example, by aligning with another group that you find unsavory, such as the Baptists who do not want to get involved in the drug trade, or you have to control a mine and redirect it to more concentration in a kind of more long-term sense. At the point at which you have a more direct source of funding, you no longer need to engage in these side activities of funding which distract you from your primary goal. These side activities are often incredibly harmful because they result from funding like slave labour. Secondly, they often create radicalisation because people flock to these groups when they are desperate and eviscerated in order to get protection. At the point at which NGOs can access them, we think that these people are less likely to join rebel groups. Rebel groups, what they need the most is more people. We help those impoverished people, we stop them from joining rebel groups, we stop these conflicts going on, and even if we don't, we massively reduce their harm, and therefore we are so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech, and I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
When you as an individual in the West who currently funds these humanitarian organisations who do so much good work across the world, fear one, that your money is supporting supporting groups which are killing civilians, who even may be committing genocidal acts, you yourself may not be able to distinguish between those things, and two, believe that this money is increasing the number of civilians being taken to create a perverse incentive. You're far less likely to give your money to these groups at all, which means that all of the benefits of what Robin talked about are massively mitigated, and all of the positive things these groups do at the moment are hugely harmed. So the comparative in this debate is the following. What they tell you is what we're able to do is save some people by being harmed in the short term and maybe even the long term in this country. We're saying that you may well be able to do that, but in the first instance you do this policy. The first time a human rights organisation does this. But what you can say is that there will likely not be a second time that this will be as effective due to the things I just mentioned, due to the ability for these organisations to continue doing these things if they know there's a chance they may get this funding again. A couple of points of responses. Firstly, just to clear up this idea, Natasha says this is not a hostage situation. Fundamentally, and principally, it is the same, right? You're saying that we're going to give you something in return in order for you to exchange money, and it's on the safety involved. Therefore, it's again another very big critical concession where they're shying away from what they need to defend, right? Secondly, they say that, look, rebel groups are not so bad, and they say, look, Sri Lankan government killed lots of Tamils. I am Tamil, right? I know that more than anybody. The sad fact is, if we had given the LTT more money at the end of the war, more civilians would have died. Not because they're callous necessarily, but because they would have used that money and those arms to fight back in the last stages of the war, and there's more civilians would have died as a consequence of that. Moreover, we say, even if that didn't exist, you necessarily prolong that conflict, right? That conflict has ended one way or another. Now, civilians are dying on their side of the house, that conflict will still be continuing, more civilians will be dying because of that money you gave them. Thirdly, this very brief thing Tash mentioned at the end, she says that you get on their side of the house and reduce the incentive to join rebel groups. You say no, you massively increase it when you increase the amount of money that they have and the power that they have. It seems now far more likely that joiners are able to provide more basic goods and services and protection than they would otherwise if they had less money but they're being defeated by governments. Finally, on rebuttal, they say, the NGOs have their own information. This is really important, right? The point that Michael tells you is not that they don't have any information at all, is that they really don't have as much information as states have when it comes to these kinds of things. Like, there is obviously the case that, like, Save the Children or whatever you want to talk about don't have as many people around, like Sri Lanka or whatever, as like government drones and government planes which they can use. Why is that so important? Only the state has information on the full picture. For example, it is planning a very important counterinsurgency in the next couple of weeks, and it has actively strangled that group into a position where they don't have any arms anymore, where they don't have any funding. You massively undermine that if you don't have that information. The reason why we tell you usually because they're so secret, right? So let's deal with this idea about this, like, about why Tash tries to recharacterize this debate. It's one about when civilians are trapped accidentally. We say where in the examples where they're often trapped accidentally, this debate doesn't occur, but the vast amount of circumstances, because the groups are more than willing to let NGOs in anyway. Why? Because there's massive harm to those groups from harming those civilians in those situations. First of all, what we say is that they risk, for example, that those civilians in those large numbers are trapped and now are like poorly treated, don't have food and water, that those groups can overwhelm them in large numbers. It's a huge risk for those individuals. Secondly, you necessarily have to rely on the support of civilians on the ground in other situations, right? But you turn that so, like, so therefore, like, in those areas, that's not really what this debate is about. But even in those circumstances, you still now make it more likely for these groups to harm those civilians in order to get this money, or even threaten to harm those civilians in order to get this money, because they know that this money is something that's going to happen, right? We say that's less likely on our side of the house. I'll take closing if they haven't.
The international community regards Hezbollah as an illegal organisation because of its ties to Iran. Yet it is part of a legitimate government in southern Lebanon and provides most of the healthcare in that region. Would they be better or worse off in providing the Syrian refugees if we weren't able to give them aid?
What we say is like overall, states are better placed to decide things, and like even if individuals, like NGOs, got a base to do it in one particular circumstance, this harms their ability to do it in other circumstances because states are better placed to act. So why is it firstly to do with this idea of we'll do it secretly? First of all, like given it's illegal and states have active interest in preventing you from doing it secretly because you're undermining their counterinsurgency tactics, they will sue you for it and they will find out. Secondly, what we say is individuals within these groups, because they know what they're doing is illegal, are very likely at least one person will leak this information to the press to say, look, I work for one of these organisations and this is what we've done. Note, it only has to come out in public once for the harms we're going to talk about to exist. So what happens now? People fear that their money is going towards funding these groups. They're terrified of it. Right? Why are they so terrified? Right? Tash gives a good response of, people realise that costs and calculations need to be made in certain circumstances. Right? We say, insofar as that's true, they want states to make that decision, because those are the individuals they elect and are accountable over, rather than individual actors. Moreover, the difference here is you're actively funding horrible groups who they see on television committing acts like awful atrocities, right? They even want to shy away from the genocide debate. But as an average citizen, you often don't know what, if the LTC is committing a genocide against the Sinhalese civilians, or just protecting Tamils. Why then are you likely to be risk-averse and not fund it anyway? A, because of the horror of what you could be funding. No, people in general don't have a separate amount of money they just keep aside to give to humanitarian organisations. You actually have to get that money from them by convincing them that this money is worth more to other people than it is to you as an individual. You harm that when you say, look, this money may well be incentivizing hostage taking, may well be funding groups who are killing lots of people, and we say that money then dries up. Why is it so bad, even if it dries up a little bit? We say it will dry up a lot, but why is it so bad if it even dries up a little bit? We say it harms every single bit of any single activity that happens by these groups at all, right? So all of the things Michael tells you about whether it be long-term services, or even the services provided in those regions where the groups are allowing these organisations in without this deal, right? You harm those things. So when Tash says we want to help more civilians to their side of the house, unfortunately we don't, because if this money dries up in any way at all, this happens to its aggressive time, because people fear that this is where the money is going to, and therefore we can't help these people. The question we want to ask ourselves at the end of this debate is, will this increase the number of these people being harmed by being taken hostage? We say yes, and even if that were true, we say the money will dry up, and therefore this is a completely illegitimate act. Couldn't be prouder to oppose.
would like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for the speech, and I would like to invite a member of the government.
Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the floods in Pakistan left 20 million people thirsty, and the West let those people go thirsty because it refused to cooperate with the Taliban. The problem for opposition in this debate is that these forces are not transient, fleeting, or weak, but they are permanent features in these futures of these nations, and you need to engage with them to get any kind of long-term good outcome. That's what we're going to bring you an extension. The most important point in this debate, that we are the side that moderates these groups and makes them better. Before I do that though, I'm going to add more extension material about the morality of these decisions, and finally, I'm going to talk to you about why these are the only groups who can distribute aid, and the only groups you can't rely on the state who is also involved in this conflict to distribute aid. Firstly, on morality, we say that the West and all actors in the international arena need to make nasty geopolitical trade-offs all the time. That's why, for instance, we recognise and give aid to dictatorships that may abuse the rights of their citizens, but ultimately decide that those citizens having things like economic rights, the ability to live, is worth it, right? So we also know that these guys are also being complicit in deaths, right? Even if we accept the assertion that we prevent the conflict, these guys are also complicit in deaths by not actually giving these people food and water and letting them starve and those types of things. So what this debate essentially comes down to then is which trade-off should we prefer? Should we prefer the risk of death to conflict, or should we prefer the risk of death by not giving them aid? The first thing to say is that we think the activation distinction breaks down here when you have the capacity to act and you don't do so right. We say that it's very different to giving someone a gun when you are the one who can give them food and water and you refuse to do that type of thing. But secondly, we would say that the harms of not giving these people food and medicine are immediate and certain, whereas the harms of the conflict continuing into the future are speculative and uncertain to continue into the future. We think the moral obligation falls on you to do the thing that you know is going to happen rather than speculate about the thing that is going to happen in the future. Thirdly, about the point of information I asked, is that we actually think that legality is a terrible metric for deciding who you owe a moral obligation to, right? Because legality is constructed and decided by arbitrary political forces, right? The point of information I asked about the Khmer Rouge was really important. So Vietnam ousted the Khmer Rouge in 1979 because the United States had ongoing tensions with Vietnam. They continued to recognize genocidal regime as the legitimate government in that nation. We don't think humanitarian organizations should buy into that type of political force play and those types of things, because obviously their primary obligation is helping individuals on the ground, not respecting things like arbitrary international laws, which we think are meant to serve powerful interests, not the interests of the most people, the ones that they care about, because they're international interests. Opening opposition tells you that more guns equals more atrocity. The first thing to say is that's untrue. I'm going to tell you why in my next argument. But the second thing is, on a utilitarian capitalist, and opening up the touch on this that I'll add further, we think that guns kill far less people than things like disease, things like lack of food and water, right? So like cholera outbreaks when there are refugees on the border can have the potential to kill millions and millions of people. But we literally don't see that. It's very rare to see a genocide actually goes that far and those types of things. But thirdly, right, we just oppose the notion that you, because you're involved in conflict, makes you any moral actor in this debate. We stand by the right of groups to oppose with violence oppressive regime that the West just decided they want to recognize, right? We think these groups aren't all bad. We should support them in their fight and doing these types of things. Second point in this debate, this is the most important. How do we actually moderate these groups, given they are likely to be a long-term feature of these states in the long term? Opening opposition makes a really damaging concession. That these groups need to be seen to be doing good, which answers why they will actually accept this aid. Because we think if they reject this aid, then the image of them is that they aren't doing good. There is something that they could do to help their citizens, and they're actively turning their back away from it. So we think they're likely to accept that aid. But secondly, once they accept that aid, we think we get some way in terms of undermining their message. Because now yes, they are doing good, but the West doesn't have the role to play that type of thing. The West is also seen as a good actor, which we think ultimately moderates those groups. We also tell you in this debate that we mitigate the incentive for atrocities, right? Firstly, right, if you kill all the civilians, then you have no civilians to give the aid group access to. So you can't keep getting the funding that's aid are giving to you, right? So we don't think they're likely to murder civilians. But secondly, right, we say that if we accept this is a hostage situation, one of the reasons why people murder hostages is they're actually really expensive and really hard to keep alive, right? So rather than you and people using up your precious resource, let's murder them. So let's accept the aid. So we can accept the aid, give it to these people, and that means we think, we save lives. But moreover, we think that even in the case where we do oppose these points, we can oppose them in other ways. For instance, we can make short-term trade-offs like this in the case of a long-term war. We can make a short-term trade-off and agree to give the Taliban some funding in a broader struggle while also fighting a broader war against them. I'll take a point of interest for the one.
Under the status quo, you don't have an active incentive to harm civilians. Now, on your side of the house, you absolutely do, because there's funding coming from doing so.
No, you have an incentive to harm civilians because they cost money to keep alive. We give you money if you keep them alive and you have access to them. We win those incentives in this way. One thing I want to talk about in this speech is about distribution. Open opposition lied when they said that these groups are weak. Firstly, they have the capacity to control vast numbers of vulnerable civilians and the public safety. But also, we think these individuals are often very popular. They're seen as the only legitimate way to oppose an oppressive state. We give the example of the Taliban in certain areas of Pakistan, who are seen as legitimate in a religious sense, whereas the secular Pakistani state is not. We give the example of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which yes, was an illegal militia group, but now is the state because it's the only one that's legitimate. So, we think that given that these groups are powerful, why do we need to cooperate with them? One, because they control the land, and we don't think that the state, who may also be involved in this conflict, can distribute aid to them, because they're not going to get the type of access, right? We think that humanitarian groups are important in that respect, because they're neutral, they're not actually involved in that conflict. Secondly, military capacity is the type of thing that military capacity will use for the state use of guns, is the type of thing that would escalate the conflict, right? Three, we just don't think that the individuals in the circumstance would necessarily accept aid from the state, don't necessarily accept aid from the state, because they're not necessarily seen as legitimate. They have a lot of buy-in to these so-called illegal groups, right? But fourthly, right, this debate has to take place where those states are failing. Because if the state is able to provide aid, we wouldn't need humanitarian groups to actually intervene and go in and do type of things. This debate occurs in the context of which humanitarian groups are the only ones who can do it. And we're telling you why these individuals aren't likely to trust the state. Mr. Speaker, we think these groups are part of the long-term features of these countries because they have the capacity to control the lives of thousands, if not millions, of vulnerable individuals. We're the team that shows you how you moderate them in the long term, make them less likely to commit atrocities, and that's what I want to say.
I'd like to thank the member of the government for that speech, and now I'd like to invite the members of the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, if you think about it, this motion actually gives us very little clues about the kinds of groups that we're dealing with, except for one thing, that they reached out to international organizations, usually in the West, for help. So all of the kinds of speculations about the incentives and the behaviors of these groups are premised on an understanding about the nature of those groups and the circumstances in which they find themselves. The importance of the clue that they reached out to international organizations, given all of the reasons we hear from government that it is against their incentives to do so, suggests that these groups are weak, that perhaps they are on their death row, that only when these groups are at their most vulnerable do they have an incentive to reach out at all. All of the teams thus far have missed the comparative. We don't have this kind of epistemic uncertainty about whether these groups will continue or not. The only groups that will reach out to international organizations are those that are weak. Two arguments in this speech in extension. First, I'm going to explain why this sustains groups that will otherwise most probably fail. Second, I'm going to extend material about the nature of humanitarian groups. First, why are these, in almost all instances, going to be the most vulnerable groups? First of all, because they're doing things like taking part in kidnapping. Opening government tries to say that this isn't the group they want to talk about. But it is the most likely group that will reach out, so they can't say no if they want to benefit, access all their benefits. The reasons why we know this are most groups don't have the resources to carry out effective siege over the long term. Even those groups that do often start out with individual and particularistic strategies like kidnapping. The fact that they go to international organizations who don't have that much money to go to, when after the US government has already likely said no to those groups,
The fact that these groups are engaging in isolated incidents rather than an overall strategy and engaging in things like kidnapping suggests that they're ready. So the kinds of groups they must deal with in this debate are groups like MH, Boko Haram, and Somali pirates, who form the vast majority of the people who are likely to reach out. But second of all, in the cases of sieges, right, they give us the best possible reason to believe that these sieges are unlikely to last going into the future. They themselves say that they require civilian support. The fact that people are dying of cholera suggests that that siege is unlikely to last when they no longer have the legitimacy of their own people. So all of the material Tash gives us about the role that starvation plays suggests that those regimes are unlikely to last. Moreover, we know this, right, because it is against every incentive to reach out to the West, whom by their own confession they distrust. When Hezbollah starts reaching out to the West, you know that they are on the last possible steps, right? Even and quickly, in response to the idea that people can escape, right? That is vastly against the characterization that we get from opening government. That the point of these organizations is that they want to establish a long-term and stable presence. The fact that that is no longer a viable alternative is the only reason why they return to international organizations. Given that, why does the comparative suddenly become clearer? Because the choice becomes sustaining organizations that would otherwise fail versus ones that would otherwise continue. The comparison that opening gives us is a good one. They say that these groups are unlikely to continue on things like sieges, and instead, go towards things like diamond mines and other economic projects. Why is that better? 4 reasons. First is a reason that Tasha provides. That is an incredibly time-consuming process. The benefit of that is that the state is able to intervene, the state is able to respond more quickly. But second of all, many organizations simply don't have the capacity to do things like take over diamond mines that leave them out. Finally, it removes the ideological component of the kind of attack they take out. That ISIS is able to succeed, and what they get out of kidnapping is that they cause terror from those actions that's incentivized under their thumb. Moreover, recognize that all of the good arguments that Owen gives about how this improves legitimacy and how this improves funding for those organizations only makes sense given the context that these organizations are likely to face. In their next speech, they need to deal with that characterization because that is well missing from this debate. No thank you. Finally, on this question about the impact that this has on the group, let's talk about moderation. Because despite its like aspirational title of the kind of things we want to address at an extension, it was insufficiently justified. One of the most important reasons they give is that the West is seen as a good actor within those areas. If those organizations felt that it was a threat to their legitimacy, which is what Pat tells us, right? They're unlikely to show off the role that the West does. So they're likely to try and do things like keep it secret, for instance. We agree with the word that's unlikely to spread, because that's the kind of thing they do. But second of all, the very worst organizations aren't reaching out to the West at all. That is to say that if they are ideologically opposed to the West, ideologically opposed to these institutions, those aren't the kind of groups that are going to moderate in the first instance. What does this do with humanitarianism, right? We're going to say and add to CG material. Given that by and large, we think, given that we're not talking about the US government, for instance, this is something you know for sure. Yeah.
So, as the dominance literature shows, all groups want funding because funding helps their objective, right? Tasha asks you for an example of where it is not obvious to an A group that this group is weakening that they shouldn't provide. You still have it. And even if it were the case that they're weakening, we gave you analysis to help seek out more radical sources.
Given that I've given you reasons to believe why the most likely instance is that all of these groups who reach out for funding are by and large weakening, whenever they whenever they implement the model you propose before this house, they will have erred in their judgment and they will fail, right? So second, what does this do for humanitarianism? It increases local distrust within those regimes, right? That Cambodia still continues to distrust the West, for instance, and that's an example that they provide. We think it leads to local distrust and reduces their efficacy in carrying those things out. Second, you reduce your association and your work with governments like the United States who say that we won't work with organizations who negotiate with terrorists, right? Given that that is the major funding for them, that goes down. Finally, the people who support some kind of entity who are opposed it's not always about money. We think those experts are unlikely to help. The most important question in this debate is the nature of the groups we're talking about. We gave you the most convincing characterization that we're proud to.
I would like to thank the member of the opposition for their speech, and now I'd like to invite Government Whip.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when you premise an extension on the wording of a topic, you better get the wording of the topic right. Because in this case, this House believes that organizations should be allowed to give funding, resources, services to legal armed groups when it's made a condition to be access to vulnerable people. There is nothing in the topic about these groups reaching out to the West. And in terms of groups that traditionally oppose Western intervention in these regions, NGOs that they're suspicious of. What we think that in those circumstances we need to do is bribe those organizations with services, with resources, so we can get to the people who need our help. We don't think that these are weak actors, we think these are some of the most entrenched political organizations within these regions. That's what we brought you in extension. I'm going to ask 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, what are our moral obligations as West, NGOs, and vulnerable parties? Secondly, how do we moderate extremist and illegal groups within the world? And thirdly, how do we get the least death and suffering of vulnerable parties? Firstly, what are our moral obligations to vulnerable parties? And how should we weigh that against the capricious political incentives that we use to define illegality and legality? Because when this bench got up and told you that we prefer state actors in the distribution of aid, that mistook 2 important parts of context. Number one, why these illegal armed groups exist in the first place, and secondly, why these vulnerable groups exist in the first place. And we think the reason is actually much one and the same, which is these are often failed states that have very little control over the population of their country, and inability to provide resources to their citizens, and political incentives to neglect certain aspects. So when we see legitimate actors like Hezbollah starting up in southern Lebanon, or the Taliban taking regions of northwest Pakistan, it's not because they just take that from the state. They emerge as a legitimate political alternative to that state, and they often have massive public support because they act as service providers, leaders, and a political voice of resistance against that state that has failed their needs. Not like it just also that they also happen to engage in armed conflict with the West, but we think that is entirely irrelevant to the actual provision of services to people at the point that they need them. There was this banter in this debate about whether or not we have a moral obligation to persist in terms of genocidal states. We probably, at closing, we're agnostic as to that reality. The reality is, though, that if you're talking about a genocidal group, there really is no incentive for that group to take its aid or assistance, given that they don't want you to have access to those vulnerable parties, given that they want to kill those vulnerable parties. But when we're talking about Rajavinothan, the Taliban, the insurgency group that led to the formation of Somaliland, these are the types of actors that we think have an incentive to look after their mission, and we give them the resources to be able to do it when we engage with them in the way that we envisage. But the second part of our extension was that this thing never established why illegality of these actors was a good metric for a blanket prohibition on engaging and cooperating with them. Because normally, if we saw citizens suffering, starving, or dying of thirst, we would cooperate with whoever necessary to get those people food and water. So it's important in this debate that despite us having it in our extension, trying to get it out there twice, the opening to deal with, they didn't deal with the fact that the international institutions saw the state of Cambodia as an illegal armed group between the periods of 1979 and 1994. While people in Cambodia seeing that as a legitimate government was certainly preferable to an organization that had murdered 30% of their population. But finally, we brought you an extension and added layer to our opening, which told you that in a utilitarian sense, more people die of disease and thirst and poverty than they do from these organizations. As the West, where we can save a life And don't, it's not those illegal organisations putting a gun to the head of these horrible people and pulling the trigger. It's us. And we shouldn't be complicit in that type of moral bankruptcy. Secondly, how do we moderate these groups? Because we feel like they wanted to say that this gives an incentive for these organisations to create more vulnerable people in order to get this aid. But that is in tension with the types of organisations that play in this debate. The political actors with political agendas who are often more popularly accepted than the state, and whose core raison d'etre is providing a better way of life for people to support and give them legitimacy within those key questions. No. In that context, to the extent that those organisations refuse aid, that is inconsistent with that reason for existing. They have to explain that to their people who are dying. We don't think that pro-Russian troops in the Ukraine or the Taliban in North Pakistan are going to do that. So the consequences will be bring them to the table and entrench and normalise their aims as being one in which we support the people and take closely the goal. Okay.
Okay, so groups which already care about those civilians, already let these groups in to help, right? You create incentives for the other ones and these ones to keep doing this in order to get more money that you say they need.
No, because these groups are fundamentally suspicious of the West. They're fundamentally suspicious of the NGO actors that they see as otherwise threatening villages. When we give them resources, when we put them in control, they have no reason to fear us in the way that we give aid to their people. It just enhances the messaging that we're already giving to those people, which is we are the ones who care about you, we are the ones who want to protect you. But at the same time, we're using their claim to hatefulness. So finally, a little bit more on this extension that we got about reaching out. I've already dealt with why this premise is bad, but the extension can rebuts itself, right? Because to the extent that these are the weakest, most vulnerable groups, they're groups where this policy is least likely to be necessary. Ones where we probably don't need to make the type of compromise in this debate because the state does have the capacity to go on top of them. If they don't control very many vulnerable people, then there's not a lot at stake and we probably won't need to give them more than a few guns to go and give food to those people, so we don't need to exacerbate the harm as much. Thirdly, how do we lead to less death and suffering? Firstly, Nick told you that we remove the incentive of these organisations to kill people under their control, because oftentimes one of the biggest incentives is the cost of keeping them alive. Secondly, we told you that we remove all of the incentives that are based on necessity, things like attacking convoys, things like expanding control over regions that have more resources. By giving these people those resources, we remove those incentives in a way that protects the lives of vulnerable people. Finally, we told you that it doesn't really matter whether these institutions accept or refuse this, because either way it undermines their message and moderates it in the long term. Because ultimately, if they accept it, it undermines the message of hatred against the West to say, and if they refuse it, it undermines the message to care about their people. This wedges these organisations away that means they have no choice but to moderate, no choice but to protect those people. We're very proud of the process.
I'd like to thank the Government Whip for their speech, and now to conclude the debate, I would like to invite the Government Secretary.
Panel. Hitherto, the government bench has suffered from one single, irredeemably naive assumption. That was groups with vast, like illegal groups with vast swaths of land and controlling areas for protracted amounts of time would actually insist that we gave them some form of funding in exchange for intervention, right? What are we defending on opposition bench? One, we're defending, as the opposition told you, the state making these decisions, but secondly, we're defending agreeing to go into these areas, like government bench wanted, but refusing to be complicit in the deaths of innocent civilians. The previous speech was remarkably glib at responding to our extension. That's probably a bad sign if you can respond to the extension in one sentence, right? This is what Bo told you. Bo told you that it's unnecessary complicity, right? How much money, realistically, do you think it would be necessary for the Red Cross, a religious institution, to bribe? Because what he said is, this is been happening in the world where these humanitarian organizations offer money in exchange for access to these groups. How much money would the Red Cross need to offer ISIS, like fundamentally ideologically opposed to actually access these areas, right? We don't think that that's realistic at all, because realistically speaking, that these organizations don't have that sort of funding. The kinds of groups that are likely to reject other forms of funding, reject the kinds of things opening government wants to talk about, like potentially like alternative sources of lucrative funding, are the kinds of groups we want to talk about. Where the very last resort is to insist on people who they know are very, very willing to enter these areas, and then insist that we give them the necessary means for them to extend their operation. That said, two questions in this debate. One, who's the most likely group to actually ask for this funding, and what does that mean in terms of the implications of our extension, and secondly, whether or not this harm or benefit the lives of civilians within that area. Quickly then, before those two questions, just a quick chat about morality, right? These guys want to talk about the existence of some kind of utilitarian framework on mutually values. We told you except our claim is that we have less civilians dying on no side of the house. That's one half of the extension delta. Okay, who's likely to actually ask for this funding? Opening governments gave us reasons to believe that the kinds of groups who are going to insist on these funding are ones who are vulnerable already. Why? 4 reasons for gave you which the previous speech refused to accept. One, that alternative sources of funding exist, right? These alternative sources of funding are a lot more lucrative, right? These are diamond mines and like the state potentially funding them. In the event that they don't have access to these, then they're more likely to turn to alternative sources, which is where this debate places now. Secondly, like we already accepted, and again, material out of opening government, the kinds of groups that are going to come to you are the ones who are the kinds of people who own vast swaths of land that aren't actually going to kidnap us, already need you to access this, right? They need the buy-in of the local civilians in order for them to continue to operate. So it's not likely that they're going to insist that you give them that money. That's too high a risk for them to take in the event that you say, no, these civilians die and they lose their legitimacy. Literally also, when I respond to the third thing Bob told you with regards to the kind of groups who are going to ask this is just think about the operational budget of Venezuela Frontier, right? MSF, example, that came up with the government. It's incredibly unlikely that MSF is going to give money that's going to run ISIS, right? That's a pretty large operation. The kind of groups are going to insist on it. It's like Boko Haram, which has the fringes of like falling apart. The fourth thing Bob told you was that there often exists ideological mistrust of these groups, so they have a really high bar before they actually allow you to access these areas. So what do all these 4 reasons mean? Quite like I'll take you my marches when I get to my second question. What do these 4 areas mean? 4 areas mean, one, the comparativeness debate was missed by both government benches. It wasn't a situation where we go and bribe groups which wouldn't otherwise happen, because they never have the incentive to agree because of the 4 reasons I've given. And secondly, it wasn't groups which own a sort of area where they're just trying to like enable you to provide education in these areas, because they need the buy-in of the local population, so they were never going to insist to begin with that to give them funding before they enter. So then, given this, the previous speech again, refused to know what does this mean? It means 3 things which are particularly harmful for the government branch. One, it means the marginal impact of any source of funding is very likely to extend the rights a lot longer than these guys wanted to concede. The second thing is it incentivizes the creation of these vulnerable groups, right? These guys want to say, oh no, but you never want to create this because for you, but you never want to create vulnerable groups. Because in order for you to succeed, you need the buy-in of the local population. The reason why that argument falls out of this debate is that those aren't the groups we're talking about. The TPP and the Taliban would happily get MSF in without requiring funding in the areas, because they control these areas, and in order for them to continue to succeed, it's very necessary that they allow them to go. The third thing is it makes it very difficult for the state to enter in these areas and make it decisive or decisive. Just think about it, right? Imagine Amnesty International was actually in the eastern part of Nigeria, where one people around us. How likely is it that the Nigerian government was actually able to intervene in those areas and make meaningful gains and the final frontier with the fight with IS. It's incredibly unlikely that the state isn't going to want to incur all the kinds of problems associated with like messing up a massive international comparison was missed in this debate. Okay.
Look, these groups may or may not be consistent features of the political landscape. The point is this: people are dying not because of the illegality of the group, but because of the associated harms in any conflict of not having NGO access. We provide that access to ensure the conflict doesn't expand otherwise what you
First thing I told you, as in circumstances where you guys want to talk about like tolerant attitudes to things, they have the incentive to let you access those groups already. The second thing I told you is that given that that's the case, who's most likely to ask for money if you're the kind of groups who need that money in order to survive? Given that, let's let these groups die out and okay, how does this harm civilians? Because the African government was too happy to concede too many parts of this debate. They told you that they're going to fight the harm of the conflict being extended. That conflict being extended means civilian deaths being calculated being perpetuated in a way that we're not as a humanitarian group in an epistemic position to evaluate. The second thing is we're not going to intervene in instances of genocide, right? This was the concession that came out of the government. How on earth are you going to evaluate whether or not what's going on within these areas is actually genocidal? We don't know. Okay, because the government wants to talk about moderation, we told you that those are the groups we're talking about. But secondly, you give whatever groups are talking about additional legitimacy. You enable them to recruit individuals and further their ability to actually have funding. Undermine the ability, like and this came out of open opposition, undermine the ability of this humanitarian group to do its job in the first place because it doesn't have access to funding and people are less likely to join who they believe is complicit. Panic. The comparison to debate is clearly missed because nobody's going to insist that MSF give them money in any of the circumstances that we want to talk about. Incredibly proud.
And let's give them another round of applause.